You are creating a sales application that will manage many transactional components and include several Azure cloud services. The processing of customer orders, billing, payments, inventory, and shipping will be handled by various cloud services. You must suggest a solution that will allow the cloud services to asynchronously exchange transactional data using XML messages. What should the recommendation contain? A. Azure Traffic Manager. B. Azure Service Fabric. C. Azure Data Lake. D. Azure Service Bus. To satisfy the security and compliance requirements after migrating App 1 to Azure, you must enforce the data modification restrictions. What should you do? A. Implement Azure Resource Locks. B. Create an access policy for the blob service. C. Modify the access level of the blob service. D. Create Azure RBAC assignments. A solution for the Azure IoT Hub that will contain 50,000 IoT devices is what you are designing. Temperature, device ID, and time data will all be streamed by each device. Every second, 50,000 records will be written on average. Near real-time visualization of the data will be used. You must suggest a service that can store and search the data. Which two services would you suggest? Please select two correct answers. A. Azure Time Series Insights. B. Azure Table Storage. C. Azure Event Grid. D. Azure Cosmos DB SQL API. You intend to set up an HPC cluster in Azure that will make use of a third-party scheduler. You must suggest a method for setting up and controlling the HPC cluster node. What should the recommendation contain? A. Azure Automation. B. Azure Lighthouse. C. Azure Cycle Cloud. D. Azure Purview. You must suggest a remedy that satisfies App 1's data specifications. Which deployment strategy should you advise for each availability zone that houses an instance of App 1? A. An Azure Data Lake store that uses GeoZone redundant storage. B. An Azure SQL database that uses active georeplication. C. An Azure Cosmos DB that uses multi-region writes. D. An Azure Storage account that uses GeoZone redundant storage. You have an on-premises Active Directory domain that is synchronized with an Azure Active Directory tenant. Web App 1 is an internal web application that is hosted on your premises. Web App 1 makes use of Windows Integrated Authentication. Some users access the on-premises network via remote access but do not have VPN access. You must grant single sign-on access to Web App 1 to the remote users. What two features ought to be incorporated into the solution? Please select two correct answers. A. Azure AD Enterprise Applications. B. Azure AD Application Proxy. C. Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. D. Conditional Access Policies. To create a monthly report of all new Azure Resource Manager resource deployments in your Azure subscription, you must suggest a solution. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Advisor. B. Azure Monitor Action Groups. C. Azure Activity Log. D. Azure Analysis Services. You are creating a state application that will manage many transactional components and include several Azure cloud services. Customer orders, billing, payment processing, inventory management, and delivery are handled by various cloud services. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using XML messages. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Service Fabric. B. Azure Data Lake. C. Azure Notification Hubs. D. Azure Queue Storage. Several virtual machines are deployed by your business both on-premises and on Azure. ExpressRoute is installed and set up for connectivity from on-premises to Azure. There are problems with network connectivity on certain virtual computers. To determine whether packets from Azure to the virtual machines are being accepted or prohibited, you must study the network traffic. Solution: install and configure the Azure Monitoring Agent and the Dependency Agent on all the virtual machines. Use VM Insights in Azure Monitor to analyze the network traffic. Does this meet the goal? A. Yes. B. No. You intend to distribute several Azure Web App instances across various Azure regions. Support rate limiting. Balance requests between all instances. Ensure that users can access the app in the event of a regional outage. Solution: you use Azure Front Door to provide access to the app. Does this meet the goal? A. Yes. B. No. You are creating a program that will run on Azure. The program will store video files with sizes varying from 50 megabytes to 12 gigabytes. Users will be able to access the application online, and it will employ certificate-based authentication. You must suggest a location for the video files to be stored. The solution must minimize storage costs while offering the quickest read speed. What ought you suggest? A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure Files. C. Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. D. Azure Blob Storage. You have an Azure SQL database with the name SQL and a multi-tier app with the name APPL. Users utilize the APPL client to read data from SQL that is written by the backend service of the app. During periods of high utilization, the users experience delays retrieving the data. You need to minimize how long it takes for data requests. What should you include in the solution? A. Azure Cache for Redis. B. Azure Synapse Analytics. C. Azure Content Delivery Network. D. Azure Data Factory. You have an Azure SQL database with the name SQL and a multi-tier app with the name APPL. Users utilize the APPL client to read data from SQL that is written by the backend service of the app. During periods of high utilization, the users experience delays retrieving the data. You need to minimize how long it takes for data requests. What should you include in the solution? A. Azure Cache for Redis. B. Azure Synapse Analytics. C. Azure Content Delivery Network. D. Azure Data Factory. What do Azure Regions Availability Zones do? A. Different regions of Azure. B. Different Azure data centers within a region. C. Different data centers owned by competitors. D. Virtual locations within an Azure data center. What are regions in Azure? A. Virtual locations within Azure data centers. B. Azure data centers located in the same city. C. Geographical locations around the globe that contain Azure data centers. D. Azure virtual networks. When deploying a resource on Azure, what choice do you frequently have to make? A. Choose the network where you want your resource deployed. B. Choose the region where you want your resource deployed. C. Choose the server where you want your resource deployed. D. Choose the data center where you want your resource deployed. Josh is working at PTG Ltd. Has an on-premises Hyper-V cluster containing 20 virtual machines. Given, some of the virtual machines are based on Windows and some in Linux. Josh has been asked to migrate the virtual machines onto Azure. Requirement: he has been asked to suggest a solution that would be used to replicate the disks of the virtual machines to Azure. Also, the solution must ensure that the virtual machines remain available when the migration of the disks is in progress. Solution: Josh decides to create an Azure storage account that has the file service and blob service and then use the data migration assistant. Would the solution suggested by Josh meet the requirement? A. Incorrect. B. Correct. Mark is working at PTG Ltd. Has 2 Azure virtual machines deployed in different regions. Given, each of the virtual machine has a public IP address that has been assigned to its network interface. Also, an application is installed on the virtual machines. Requirement: Peter has been asked to implement Azure front door-based load balancing across the virtual machines. He needs to ensure the application on the virtual machines only accept traffic that is routed from Azure front door. Which of the following options should Mark choose to meet the requirement? A. Network security groups with application security groups. B. Azure private link. C. Service endpoints. D. Network security groups with service tags. When deploying a resource on Azure, what choice do you frequently have to make? A. Choose the network where you want your resource deployed. B. Choose the region where you want your resource deployed. C. Choose the server where you want your resource deployed. D. Choose the data center where you want your resource deployed. PTG Ltd. intends to use Azure to deploy web apps. Consider the requirements for the following company, which were listed. 1. Load balancing traffic at layer 7. 2. Protecting the web application from SQL injection attacks. 3. Implementing cookie-based session affinity. Which of the available Azure services would you advise using to deploy web applications to Azure that fulfill the specified criteria? A. Azure Traffic Manager. B. Azure Load Balancer. C. Azure Network Watcher. D. Azure Application Gateway. AZ-305 Practice Test. AZ-305 is a Microsoft certification exam that tests your knowledge of designing Microsoft Azure infrastructure solutions. It is a difficult exam, so thorough preparation is necessary to pass it. The AZ-305 practice test is a great way to prepare for the actual exam. You can use it to measure your progress, identify areas that need further study, and improve your exam-taking strategies. The AZ-305 exam is an expert-level certification that requires extensive knowledge of Microsoft Azure. To prepare for the AZ-305 exam, you can use online guides and learning paths that provide free or paid training videos. In addition, you can also join study groups to help you stay on track with your preparations. These groups can also help you improve your response time, which will save you valuable time during the exam.